You can judge a man's clothes in a second, but it may take a lifetime to understand the character inside them. Ethan Carter adjusted the worn leather strap of the satchel resting against his shoulder before looking up at the gleaming glass tower of Whitmore Holdings. The 42-year-old single father had restored priceless furniture for museums, historic homes, and private collections across Washington, yet his own blue plaid flannel shirt, dark jeans, and carefully polished work boots revealed nothing about the quiet mastery he carried in his hands. Earlier that morning, he had packed his 9-year-old daughter Lily's lunch, walked her to school, and promised he would be home before dinner. She had smiled, hugged him tightly, and reminded him not to forget the homemade cookie she had slipped into his bag. Ethan smiled at the memory as he stepped toward the front entrance of one of Seattle's most respected corporations. The revolving glass doors reflected a man who looked ordinary, and that had never bothered him. Inside the marble lobby, executives hurried past in tailored suits while receptionists greeted important visitors with polished professionalism. Ethan approached the welcome desk with a calm smile. "Good morning. I have an appointment to deliver restoration documents requested by Chairman Richard Whitmore." Before the receptionist could answer, another voice interrupted from nearby. "Excuse me." Ethan turned politely. Claire Whitmore, the 37-year-old chief executive officer of Whitmore Holdings, crossed the lobby with confident strides. Her ivory blazer, navy dress, and composed expression reflected years of leadership inside the family company. She glanced briefly at Ethan, then at the weathered satchel hanging from his shoulder. "Vendor deliveries use the service entrance around the corner," she said evenly. "I am sure someone downstairs can receive whatever you are dropping off." Several employees slowed their pace just enough to notice the exchange. Ethan never raised his voice. "I appreciate your concern, ma'am. Chairman Whitmore personally invited me." Claire folded her arms gently. Everyone claims to know the chairman when they arrive without looking prepared for a corporate meeting. A few quiet chuckles drifted through the lobby before disappearing into awkward silence. Ethan simply nodded. "I understand why you might think that." He neither defended himself nor criticized her assumption. Instead, he waited patiently with both hands resting on the leather satchel that contained carefully prepared restoration plans. The lobby doors opened once again. A sleek black sedan had just stopped outside. Security personnel immediately straightened their posture while employees instinctively stepped aside. Richard Whitmore, the 70-year-old chairman of Whitmore Holdings, entered the building with steady confidence. Several senior executives moved toward him, expecting the customary morning greeting before the day's meetings began. Instead, the chairman looked beyond every familiar face. His eyes settled immediately on Ethan. A warm smile spread across his face. Without hesitation, Richard Whitmore walked past vice presidents, directors, board members, and even his own daughter. He extended both hands toward Ethan before anyone else could speak. "Ethan," he said with genuine affection, "I was hoping you would arrive early." Ethan accepted the handshake with humble gratitude. "Thank you for inviting me, sir." The chairman held his hand firmly for another moment before turning toward the stunned employees surrounding them. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said proudly, "the man standing before you has preserved more of my family's history than anyone in this company realizes." The marble lobby fell completely silent. Claire looked from her father to Ethan, searching for an explanation that suddenly refused to fit the first impression she had formed only moments earlier. Ethan remained exactly as he had been from the beginning, quiet, respectful, and composed, proving without a single boast that dignity never needs to announce itself before the truth finally walks through the front door. The silence inside the marble lobby lingered long after Chairman Richard Whitmore released Ethan Carter's hand. Executives who had hurried through the entrance only moments earlier now slowed their pace, quietly wondering how a man dressed like a neighborhood craftsman could command such sincere respect from the founder of one of Seattle's most successful companies. Claire Whitmore remained perfectly still, her composed expression beginning to soften beneath growing uncertainty. She had spent years making confident decisions in boardrooms, negotiating multi-million-dollar agreements, and evaluating people within seconds, Yet something about this moment refused to fit the rules she had trusted for so long. Chairman Whitmore smiled warmly before placing a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Come with me," he said. "There is someone I have wanted you to meet properly for quite some time." Ethan nodded politely. "Thank you, Richard." Claire noticed that Ethan addressed her father with natural respect instead of excessive formality, the kind that only developed after years of genuine trust. As they walked toward the executive elevator, she quietly followed. Inside the private conference room overlooking downtown Seattle, sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, filling the polished walnut table with warm reflections. When a flood nearly destroyed it 8 years ago, every specialist I contacted declared it beyond repair. Claire listened quietly. Ethan never said those words. He simply asked for time. Ethan offered a modest smile. It deserved another chance. Richard continued. 6 months later, he returned it looking exactly as it had on the day my grandfather purchased it. Claire looked at Ethan with growing curiosity. "Why have I never heard this story?" Ethan answered before the chairman could speak. "Because the furniture mattered more than the person restoring it." His voice carried neither pride nor regret. It was simply the truth. The meeting continued as Ethan carefully explained the restoration proposal for the company's original founders' table, the first piece of furniture ever purchased when Whitmore Holdings consisted of a single rented office decades earlier. Every recommendation balanced historical authenticity with structural preservation. Claire found herself asking questions, not because she doubted him anymore, but because she genuinely wanted to understand his thinking. Ethan answered each one patiently, using simple language instead of technical jargon. There was no desire to impress, only a willingness to share knowledge. After the meeting ended, Ethan gathered his papers with the same quiet care he had shown when entering the building. Chairman Whitmore stood. "I will have my assistant coordinate the schedule." Ethan smiled. "That works perfectly." As he reached the elevator, Claire unexpectedly stepped forward. "Mr. Carter." Ethan turned. For a brief moment, she searched for the right words, but none arrived easily. "Thank you for coming today." Ethan smiled gently. "It was my pleasure." He entered the elevator before another word could be spoken. Claire watched the doors close, then turned toward her father. "How long have you known him?" Richard looked out across the Seattle skyline before answering. "Long enough to know that some people build furniture, while others quietly build character." Ethan has always done both. Claire remained silent. She had entered the morning believing appearance revealed everything worth knowing. By the time the elevator disappeared from view, she had begun to realize that the most remarkable people often arrived carrying nothing except humility, quiet dignity, and a story that the world had never taken the time to hear. The following Monday morning, a covered transport trailer rolled carefully into the private loading area behind Whitmore Holdings. Hidden beneath protective blankets rested the company's oldest surviving possession, the walnut desk that Richard Whitmore had purchased more than 40 years earlier when he opened his first office with little more than determination and a handwritten business plan. The desk had witnessed every milestone in the company's history, but decades of sunlight, changing temperatures, and countless relocations had left deep cracks across its surface. Chairman Richard Whitmore stood beside the trailer with quiet anticipation, while Claire Whitmore joined him carrying a digital tablet filled with meeting schedules. "This piece has never left our headquarters," she said softly. Richard smiled. "Neither has its story." Ethan Carter arrived a few minutes later in his aging pickup truck, parking beside delivery vehicles worth many times more than his own. He stepped out carrying nothing except a leather toolbox polished from years of careful use. Several employees looked curiously toward him, but unlike the previous visit, no one questioned why he was there. Ethan greeted everyone with the same calm smile before approaching the trailer. He rested one hand gently against the protective covering as though greeting an old friend. "May I?" he asked. Richard nodded. Ethan slowly, "Can it be saved?" Ethan smiled gently. "Wood remembers how it was made. If we respect that memory, there is almost always hope." Claire found herself writing down the sentence before realizing she had done so. As the restoration began inside a climate-controlled workshop prepared by the company, Ethan carefully removed one damaged panel at a time. He measured every fraction of an inch twice before making the smallest adjustment. Hours passed in peaceful concentration while sunlight slowly shifted across the room. Claire had planned to stay only 15 minutes before returning to executive meetings, yet she remained nearly 3 hours watching him work. There was something unexpectedly calming about his patience. Every movement carried purpose. Every tool returned to exactly the same place after each use. Nothing felt hurried. Nothing was wasted. During a short break, Ethan opened the lunch bag Lily had packed that morning. Inside rested a turkey sandwich, sliced apples, and another homemade cookie wrapped neatly in wax paper beside a handwritten note. "Good luck today, Dad. I know you will make history smile again. Love, Lily." Ethan smiled quietly before folding the note and placing it safely inside his wallet. Claire noticed the gesture from across the workshop. "Your daughter wrote that?" Ethan nodded proudly. "She believes old things deserve second chances." Claire smiled for the first time without reservation. "She sounds very wise." Ethan laughed softly. "She reminds me every day what really matters." Moments later, as Ethan carefully lifted one of the interior support panels, something unusual caught his attention. His fingertips paused against a narrow section of wood that produced a different sound beneath gentle pressure. He looked thoughtfully at the grain before quietly calling Richard over. "I believe your desk has been protecting a secret for many years." Richard Whitmore stepped beside Ethan Carter and watched as he gently traced the unusual seam hidden beneath the desk's interior support panel. "I have inspected this desk dozens of times over the years," Richard said quietly. "I never noticed anything unusual." Ethan smiled with characteristic humility. "Most people look at what furniture has become. Restoration teaches you to notice what it was intended to be." Using a slender wooden tool instead of metal, Ethan carefully pressed against a nearly invisible section of walnut. A soft click echoed through the silent workshop. Claire Whitmore instinctively stepped closer. A narrow compartment, perfectly concealed for decades, slowly opened inside the desk. No one spoke for several long seconds. Resting inside was a small leather envelope, its edges aged but remarkably well preserved. Richard removed it with both hands, almost reverently, as though touching a piece of his own family's heartbeat. He unfolded the letter with extraordinary care. The handwriting belonged to his late father, William Whitmore, the man who had founded the company with little more than determination, honesty, and an old desk purchased from a closing law office. Richard read silently at first. His eyes softened. He paused twice before quietly continuing aloud. "If you are reading this, then someone cared enough to preserve this desk instead of replacing it. Remember that businesses do not become great because of buildings or profits. They become great because ordinary people choose to do extraordinary work when nobody is watching." The room became still again. Claire lowered her eyes. Ethan simply listened without interrupting. Richard continued reading. "If one day you meet someone who respects craftsmanship more than recognition, protect that person. They will remind you who you were before success became comfortable." Richard folded the letter slowly, unable to hide the emotion in his voice. "I have spent years searching through family records, believing every one of my father's personal letters had already been found." Ethan answered gently. "Sometimes history waits until the right moment to introduce itself." Claire looked at Ethan with growing admiration. "You could have opened that compartment without anyone present." Ethan nodded. "I could have." "Why did you stop and call us?" she asked. Ethan looked at the old desk before answering. "Because some discoveries belong to families, not to the person restoring the furniture." Richard smiled with quiet gratitude. "That is exactly why I trust you." News of the discovery traveled quickly through the executive floor. By the afternoon, several board members had gathered in the workshop, each eager to see the hidden compartment and the remarkable letter. Among them was Executive Director Michael Lawson, a respected but highly skeptical member of the board who had often questioned Richard's decisions involving outside craftsmen. He studied Ethan for a long moment before speaking. "Remarkable timing," Michael said with a polite smile that carried unmistakable doubt. Finding a secret compartment on the very day our chairman hires a restoration specialist certainly creates an impressive story. The room grew noticeably quieter. Claire immediately understood the implication. Michael was suggesting that the discovery might have been staged. Ethan did not react with anger. He simply looked at Michael and answered calmly. The desk has been telling this story for more than 40 years. I was only patient enough to hear it. Richard stepped forward before anyone else could respond. Every board member is welcome to review the restoration records, examine the construction techniques, and consult independent historians if necessary. Then he looked directly at Michael. Truth has never been afraid of careful examination. Michael offered a courteous nod, but the uncertainty remained visible on his face. They expected dramatic moments, expensive machinery, or complicated techniques. Instead, they saw patience. They saw a man who measured every surface twice before making the smallest adjustment, who stopped every hour to wipe each tool clean before placing it back in perfect order, and who treated a 40-year-old desk with the same care another person might show a treasured family photograph. Claire Whitmore noticed something else. Ethan never seemed interested in who was watching. Whether the workshop was empty or filled with executives, his pace never changed. One afternoon, she entered carrying 2 cups of fresh coffee. Ethan looked up from the walnut panels and smiled. Thank you. That was thoughtful. Claire handed him one of the cups before glancing toward the restored sections of the desk. You have been here almost every day this week. Do you ever take a break? Ethan laughed softly. My daughter would tell you I take plenty. She insists that dinner together is not optional. Claire smiled. How old is she now? 9. Ethan answered proudly. Lily believes every evening deserves at least one story before bedtime, even if I come home covered in sawdust. Claire found herself laughing. That sounds like a wonderful rule. Ethan folded a clean cloth over the unfinished surface before taking a careful sip of coffee. It is. Children have a way of reminding adults what success actually looks like. The words lingered in Claire's thoughts long after the conversation ended. Later that evening, after most employees had gone home, she remained in her office reviewing several historical files connected to the restoration project. Curious, she requested Ethan's contractor records from the archives. She expected to find a list of prestigious clients and expensive commercial projects. Instead, she found something entirely different. Years earlier, one of the largest luxury hotel chains in the country had offered Ethan an exclusive nationwide restoration contract worth more money than most craftsmen earned in a decade. The attached correspondence included his polite reply. I am deeply grateful for your generous offer. However, my daughter has already experienced enough changes in her young life. I cannot spend most of the year traveling away from home. Please accept my sincere appreciation, and I hope you find someone who serves your company well. Claire stared at the letter in silence. She checked the date. Lily had been only 4 years old. Ethan had turned down financial security that could have transformed his entire future simply because he believed his daughter needed her father more than he needed a larger bank account. Richard Whitmore quietly entered the office without interrupting her thoughts. You found the hotel proposal. Claire nodded slowly. He never mentioned it. Richard smiled. He rarely speaks about sacrifices. He simply makes them. Claire looked toward the workshop below, where Ethan was carefully covering the desk before leaving for the evening. I spent years believing ambitious people always accepted the biggest opportunity. Richard rested a hand on the window beside her. There are different kinds of ambition. Some people chase larger offices. Others chase a life they will never regret. Outside, Ethan placed his leather toolbox into the back of his aging pickup truck before taking a small lunch container from the passenger seat. Inside rested the homemade cookie Lily had packed that morning, still untouched. He smiled warmly, broke it into 2 pieces, and shared half with an elderly security guard finishing his shift. The guard thanked him with genuine surprise. Ethan simply wished him a good evening and drove home. The desk occupied the center of the stage, not as a piece of expensive furniture, but as a symbol of where everything had begun. Ethan Carter arrived quietly through a side entrance wearing the same navy suit he reserved for church services and important family occasions. It was well tailored despite its age, carefully pressed, and worn with the same quiet confidence that had defined him from the beginning. Richard Whitmore greeted him with a warm smile before introducing him to several longtime friends. Ethan shook every hand with sincere gratitude, never mentioning his role in restoring the desk unless someone asked directly. Across the ballroom, Claire Whitmore watched every interaction. She noticed something she had overlooked during their first meeting. People did not respect Ethan because he sought attention. They respected him because he consistently gave it to others. Whether speaking with a museum curator, a maintenance employee, or a young intern attending the event for the first time, his voice carried exactly the same kindness. As dinner concluded, Richard stepped onto the stage. The conversations gradually faded until the ballroom became completely quiet. Behind him, the restored desk reflected the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, its rich walnut surface appearing almost identical to the day his father had first placed it inside a small rented office decades earlier. Richard rested one hand gently upon the polished wood before speaking. "Tonight we celebrate growth, innovation, and another successful year. But before any of those achievements existed, there was this desk." He paused, allowing his guests to study the remarkable restoration. Many believed time had taken away what could never be replaced. They were wrong. He invited Ethan onto the stage. A wave of respectful applause filled the ballroom as Ethan approached with visible humility. Richard smiled proudly. "Most of you have admired this desk tonight. Very few know the man whose patience gave it another generation of life." Ethan nodded politely, slightly uncomfortable with the attention. Richard continued. "During the restoration, another gift was uncovered. My father's hidden letter reminded me that companies are built by ordinary people who quietly choose excellence when no one is watching. I realized something else. That letter described a man I already knew." He turned toward Ethan. "For more than 12 years, whenever my family faced the impossible task of preserving our history, this man answered the call. He never requested publicity. He never asked for special treatment. He never even allowed his name to appear in our annual reports." The audience listened without moving. Richard smiled gently. "Many people believe success is measured by recognition. Ethan has spent years proving that character is measured by what you are willing to do without recognition." Claire felt her eyes drift toward Ethan. He stood exactly as he had in the lobby on their first meeting, calm, grateful, and entirely unchanged by the praise surrounding him. Then Richard reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded the letter discovered inside the desk. He read one final sentence written by his late father. "When you find someone who protects your family's legacy as faithfully as his own, never let that person wonder whether they are appreciated." Richard folded the letter before looking directly at Ethan. "My friend, thank you." The ballroom rose to its feet in a standing ovation that seemed to last far longer than anyone expected. Ethan lowered his head with quiet gratitude, accepting neither the applause nor the admiration as personal victories, but simply as kindness he hoped to honor. From across the room, Executive Director Michael Lawson remained seated, his expression thoughtful and unsettled, as though the questions he had raised only days earlier were beginning to reveal answers he had never expected. As the applause gradually settled, guests returned to their seats carrying a different kind of conversation than the one that had filled the ballroom earlier that evening. Instead of discussing quarterly earnings or future investments, they quietly spoke about integrity, craftsmanship, and the remarkable man who had spent years protecting another family's history without ever asking to be remembered. Ethan Carter stepped away from the stage as naturally as if nothing extraordinary had happened. He thanked the event staff who offered congratulations, complimented the young musicians performing near the entrance, and stopped to shake hands with the maintenance crew preparing the room for the next presentation. Claire Whitmore watched every moment with growing admiration. The recognition that would have transformed many people seemed unable to change Ethan in the slightest. He remained exactly who he had always been. She finally walked toward him, her heartbeat noticeably faster than she expected. Ethan turned and greeted her with the same gentle smile he had offered since the beginning. "You organized a beautiful evening," he said sincerely. Claire looked down for a brief moment before meeting his eyes again. There is something I should have said a long time ago. Ethan waited patiently without speaking. She drew a quiet breath. The first day you walked into our building, I looked at your clothes instead of your character. I assumed I understood your story before hearing a single sentence. I was wrong, and I have regretted that moment every day since. Ethan listened without interrupting. Around them, conversations continued softly, yet neither of them seemed aware of the crowd any longer. Claire continued, "My father always taught me that leadership begins with respect. Somehow I forgot that lesson when it mattered most. I am truly sorry." Ethan smiled with the same calm expression that had carried him through every misunderstanding. "Thank you for saying that." Claire hesitated. "You are not angry." Ethan shook his head gently. "Holding on to disappointment is like carrying unnecessary weight. It only makes the journey harder." Claire looked at him with quiet surprise. Most people would have wanted an apology much sooner. Ethan laughed softly. "Respect is always more valuable than an apology. Respect changes tomorrow. An apology only explains yesterday." His words settled deeply into Claire's heart. Before she could answer, Richard Whitmore approached carrying 2 glasses of sparkling cider. He handed one to Ethan and another to his daughter. "I thought the 2 of you might appreciate something worth celebrating." Claire smiled warmly at her father. Richard looked from one to the other before speaking. "There is something else I should mention." Ethan raised an eyebrow with friendly curiosity. Richard chuckled. "The board met this afternoon before the gala." Claire looked surprised. "You did not tell me." Richard nodded. "Some members questioned whether restoring our history should remain a temporary project." Ethan remained silent. Richard continued. "After reviewing every recommendation, every report, and every piece of work you have completed over the past 12 years, the board reached a unanimous decision." He reached into his jacket and handed Ethan a neatly folded document. "Whitmore Holdings would like to establish a permanent heritage preservation program, and we would like you to lead it." Ethan looked at the proposal without opening it immediately. "That is an incredible honor." Richard smiled. "Take your time. There is no pressure." Ethan nodded gratefully. "I will read every page after I speak with Lily. Every important decision begins with my daughter." Claire could not help smiling. Even at the most significant moment of his professional life, Ethan's first thought remained his child. As the evening drew to a close, Michael Lawson quietly approached Richard near the stage. His expression no longer carried skepticism, but reflection. "Chairman," he said sincerely, "I believe I owe both you and Mr. Carter an apology. I questioned the wrong man." Richard placed a reassuring hand on Michael's shoulder. "The important thing is not that you questioned him. The important thing is that you were willing to recognize the truth once you saw it." Michael nodded thoughtfully while watching Ethan thank another employee before leaving the ballroom, once again proving that genuine dignity does not become greater when it is finally recognized, because it was already complete long before anyone chose to notice it. The following weekend, Ethan Carter invited Richard Whitmore and Claire Whitmore to visit the small workshop where he had spent nearly 2 decades restoring furniture and rebuilding forgotten pieces of history. It stood on a quiet street outside downtown Seattle, surrounded by maple trees and neighboring homes whose front porches still welcomed evening conversations. There were no marble floors or towering glass walls, only warm sunlight pouring through wide workshop windows, the familiar scent of walnut and oak, and shelves filled with carefully labeled tools that had been collected one by one over many years. Lily Carter opened the front door before anyone could knock. "Dad, they are here," she called cheerfully before greeting the visitors with a bright smile that instantly filled the room with warmth. Claire smiled back. "It is wonderful to finally meet you, Lily." The young girl extended her hand with remarkable confidence. "My dad says every guest deserves a proper welcome." Richard laughed softly. "Your father has taught you well." Lily looked proudly toward Ethan. "He teaches me something every day." As they toured the workshop, Claire noticed framed photographs covering one wall. Some showed restored rocking chairs returned to grateful grandparents. Others captured antique church pews, school desks, family dining tables, and weathered benches that had found new life through Ethan's hands. None of the photographs featured awards or newspaper articles. Every frame celebrated the families who had taken their treasured belongings home again. Claire paused in front of one picture, showing Ethan standing beside several teenagers inside the workshop. "Who are they?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "Students from a local vocational program. Every summer they spend a few weeks learning basic woodworking." Richard looked around thoughtfully. "You never mentioned that." Ethan shrugged gently. "There was never much to mention. Some of them simply needed someone willing to teach." Lily added proudly, "Dad says people grow faster when someone believes in them before they believe in themselves." Claire quietly repeated the sentence to herself. They continued walking until they reached an empty section of the workshop where several unused workbenches stood waiting beneath the windows. Ethan noticed Claire studying the space. "I have always hoped to expand this area one day," he admitted. "There are more young people asking to learn than I have room to teach." Richard exchanged a brief glance with Claire. Neither of them spoke immediately. Finally, Claire stepped forward. What if space was no longer the problem? Ethan looked at her curiously. Claire continued with growing confidence. "Whitmore Holdings has supported education, arts, and community projects for years. We have never invested in preserving skilled trades the way your father taught Lily, or the way you preserve history." Richard smiled as his daughter continued. "I believe we should create a foundation that teaches craftsmanship, responsibility, and dignity to young people who simply need someone willing to give them a chance." Ethan remained silent for several moments, considering every word. "That would help many families," he said quietly. Claire nodded. "I would like you to help build it with us." Ethan looked toward Lily, who smiled hopefully without saying a word. He turned back to Claire. "I will agree on one condition." Claire smiled. "Name it." Ethan answered gently. "Every student who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with the same respect whether they arrive wearing work boots or business shoes. Character must always matter more than appearance." Claire extended her hand. "That is exactly the kind of foundation I want to build." In that peaceful moment, the partnership being formed had very little to do with furniture and everything to do with giving other people the same second chance that life had quietly given each of them. 1 year later, the Whitmore Craft Foundation opened its doors on a bright spring morning beneath clear Seattle skies. What had once been an empty warehouse now welcomed families, students, veterans beginning new careers, and single parents searching for a fresh start. The building reflected the same values that had quietly shaped every step of Ethan Carter's journey. Restored workbenches stood beside modern equipment. Historic photographs hung beside handwritten notes from graduates whose lives had changed because someone believed in them before they believed in themselves. Above the entrance, a simple bronze plaque carried the words from William Whitmore's hidden letter. "Ordinary people choose extraordinary work when nobody is watching." Richard Whitmore insisted those words should greet every person who entered. Ethan arrived early that morning, just as he always did. He walked through every classroom, straightened each chair, checked every tool, and quietly placed a fresh notebook at every workstation. Lily, now 10 years old, followed beside him carrying a small basket filled with pencils. "Dad," she said with a smile, "do you think they will be nervous?" Ethan nodded gently. "Probably." She handed him another pencil. "Then they will need someone to smile first." Ethan laughed softly. "You keep teaching me the important lessons." Outside, hundreds of guests gathered for the dedication ceremony. Community leaders, local business owners, former students, employees from Whitmore Holdings, and families filled the courtyard with hopeful conversation. Claire Whitmore stood beside her father, watching Ethan greet every visitor exactly the same way regardless of their background. She remembered the first morning she had seen him standing outside the front entrance of the corporate headquarters. The memory no longer. Richard stepped to the podium as the gathering became quiet. "Today is not about opening another building," he began. "Today is about opening doors that should never have been closed." He invited Ethan to stand beside him before continuing. "Years ago, I shook this man's hand because I already knew his character. Today I ask this community to follow that example, not because of what he has restored, but because of the lives he continues to restore every single day." A warm round of applause filled the courtyard. Richard then reached into a polished wooden case resting on the podium. Inside lay the original brass key from the company's first office, preserved for more than 4 decades. He placed it carefully into Ethan's hands. "This key opened the first door our family ever called home in business," Richard said. "Today it represents something even greater. May it remind every student who enters this foundation that opportunity begins when someone chooses trust over judgment." Ethan looked at the key for a long moment before quietly answering, "I will protect that trust the same way I protected your family's history." Claire stepped beside him and smiled with sincere warmth. "And we will protect it together." Their hands met naturally, not as a grand announcement, but as a quiet promise built through respect, humility, and shared purpose. Lily slipped her hand into Claire's free hand with an easy smile that made everyone nearby smile as well. There was no need for dramatic speeches after that. Students began exploring the classrooms. Families filled the workshop with hopeful conversations. The sound of laughter mixed with the steady rhythm of new projects beginning. Ethan looked around the room before his eyes rested briefly on the old walnut desk now displayed near the entrance. It had once carried the dreams of one determined businessman. Now it welcomed countless new dreams belonging to people who simply needed someone willing to believe in them. In the end, the greatest restoration had never been a piece of furniture at all. It had been the quiet rebuilding of trust, respect, second chances, and hearts that discovered true worth could never be measured by appearance, only by the grace with which a person chose to live when nobody was watching.